that he thought that getting rid, just physically as it were, of problems of famine required that one loosened up various sorts of markets. And in order to do this, you needed, in his view, to get rid of the old regulatory structures which at the time, for example, limited the movement of grain from one place to another, just because in the event of famine, the grain would become something that, in a sense, the poor people had a right to. And so what Smith's view was that markets could, and then charity could look after these things together, provided that you got rid of regulation. Let me turn now to the third of our characters, John Stuart Mill. He was English, he lived from 1806 to 1873, and he's best known really for his defence of liberty. Intellectually, he's a kind of interesting character, because as a youngster he was sort of force-fed with knowledge by his father, who was a follower of the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Who was Bentham? Well, he's best known for the doctrine of utilitarianism. This is the idea that one should assess institutions and laws and constitutions and reform them on the basis of what leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. What counts? Well, he's almost notorious for having said, look, what really counts is pleasure. And it's the intensity of pleasure and the duration of pleasure and so on that matters. And in this context, pushpin, which is a kind of simple child's game, is as good as poetry. What really counts is which gives you the more pleasure and the more intense pleasure. You don't get a sort of special rating given to pleasure from poetry, the kind of higher things, as opposed to pleasure that you get from more gross things. He was highly critical of the notion of natural rights. He thought notions of natural rights were nonsense on stilts, just complete rubbish. In his view, you had to have recourse instead to ideas about utility and happiness and so on. All of this became the background for the young John Stuart Mill. And he was fed these ideas, he was trained in languages and classical studies and economics, but the poor little chap didn't have any poetry in his life. And indeed, he was formed very much in this particular model and became a radical reformer. He was arrested at one point as a youngster for passing out information about birth control to the working class. All of this, though, led him to a kind of personal crisis and a breakdown. I think he's someone to whom poetry really mattered, and he didn't get any of it. He had this kind of breakdown, and in the course of this, he came under the influence, amongst other people, of Wordsworth and Coleridge, the Romantic poets, and he also became open to a wide range of different intellectual ideas. The result of this was that he offered, in later life, a kind of modified version of utilitarianism. He stressed the idea that from utilitarian foundations one could make a case for the importance of individual liberty. Indeed, he argued for the importance of individual liberty in a way that's more akin to the manner in which people associated with ideas about rights would do so, but he provided arguments for this on the basis of utility. How did he do it? Well, one of the things that he said is, look, if your concern is with people's happiness, with well-being, then individuals take decisions for themselves rather than having to depend on other people to decide for them. Why? Well, basically because you know your own tastes and your own preferences best. If someone says to you, what would you like for lunch? Then you are going to know this typically better than do other people. So if you're interested in people's well-being, give them the power to make the decisions. He also stressed the importance of autonomy and of self-development. Not only, he thought, does it lead to the greatest kind of satisfactions in people's lives, but he also said, look, you should tolerate oddballs. Why? Well, because they may come up with things which are useful to the rest of you, with discoveries and so on. He also is well known for having put forward an argument for toleration, for the notion that you shouldn't suppress unpopular opinions, but he bases this argument on the view that our knowledge is fallible, that we can't be certain that we're right. This, I think, probably works with regard to factual knowledge, say general scientific knowledge and things of this kind, although I'm not sure that it has all the consequences that Mill thinks follow from this idea. This is a notion we'll be exploring in one of the later lectures. But I think there is more of a problem if you look at this in the context of religious belief, because typically people claim certainty with regard to their religious beliefs, that they've been saved or whatever, and this, I think, doesn't fit very well with Mill's appeals to the notion that our knowledge is fallible. Mill's views as a whole, I think, are somewhat complex, and their legacy is a bit ambiguous. Some later writers, for example, the British writer T.H. Green, argued, following Mill in a sense, that self-development is so important that really you can base notions of an entitlement to welfare rights on such a basis, and indeed that there should be governmental intervention, if necessary, to provide what each person needs in order to develop themselves. So, this is a quick tour through some of the big figures in the history of liberalism. Let us from this turn back to our dinner party and the controversies there. What we had were clearly two different views being put forward about welfare, and there was argument that was taking place, but we can now locate it as being both about the character of liberalism and also argument between different liberals. Each of the parties, the professor and the entrepreneur, showed a certain concern for human rights and human flourishing, and they appealed to different aspects of the liberal tradition. The modern or welfare liberal, the professor, appealed to notions about rights to subsistence and ideas about self-development, which he wanted to take beyond Mill and Green to offer them as a basis for a welfare state. The classical liberal, the entrepreneur, stressed themes that you find in Smith and other aspects of Locke's work on rights. Our selective history has thus looked at some common elements between these people, but it's also posed problems about what these different views now amount to. You may say, okay, you can look at these things in historical terms, but what in effect does this amount to now? What does the argument between these people look like on an ongoing basis, not just a historical basis? And indeed, this is the very thing we'll be considering in the next two lectures. Let me turn here to remind you just what it is that's happened in this lecture. First of all, we started from the dinner table. We started from a group of friends who'd been together at school with one another, who'd then come together for a reunion and got involved in a controversy about politics, in which we analysed particularly two different perspectives, ones which will be very familiar to you. We then moved back from this to show the way in which these disagreements relate to elements within the liberal tradition, upon which, consciously or unconsciously, they're drawing. And in this context, we considered notions from John Locke and Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. If you recall in this context, notions about rights in Locke, but also a right to subsistence. The conception in Smith of rights fitting together with ideas about how a society can flourish and how people can do well within it as a result of the division of labour and the social coordination of these people's efforts. We looked also very briefly at John Stuart Mill, and in that context we looked at the way in which he developed arguments for individual freedom, not depending, as did Locke and Smith, on notions of rights, but on ideas from the utilitarian tradition, and at the way in which, too, you get ideas not just about liberty, but also ideas about toleration being put forward, a notion which also comes to play a key role within the liberal tradition. And indeed, this historical survey then led us back to wider questions about liberalism. For clearly, the kind of issues that we've looked at briefly, the ones that came up in the dinner table, are not just things that can be illuminated if we turn back to history, but they are also matters about which people are in passionate debate today. And we're going to pursue these matters in the next two lectures. In the lecture that follows immediately, I'm going to explore different aspects of liberalism. What, in a sense, makes it tick? How does it really work? And in the lecture after that, I'm going to pursue these two different interpretations of liberalism, to see what makes them tick and to see what the different arguments are on one side or the other. To try, that's to say, to see what on the one side classical liberalism amounts to, and on the other welfare liberalism, and where the balance of the argument between them might lie. Thank you very much.